Hey guys, Val here with another Frost Mage discussion, and today we're talking about Conduit and Legendary Choice in 9.05. And one of my viewers recently informed me that it's been a while since I've updated my recommendations regarding which conduits and legendary items I would use in different types of content. Unfortunately, I know we're pretty late in the 9.05 patch cycle. In fact, 9.1 is already on the PTR. And I'm sorry, guys. I started a new job. I've just been really busy with life stuff, man. But really, I think we still have at least a couple more months until 9.1 is live. So even if this helps one or two of you out there, it's worth it for me to make the video. And besides, if you guys like this format, I can use it again for 9.1. So let's do it. So first, let's talk about conduits. Now, I apologize. If you're not Venthyr, this will obviously look a little different. I'm going to cover Venthyr options here in this video, since that's the most popular covenant for Frost Mages. But I am working on getting you guys some input specifically for Night Fae players, and what you guys do differently as far as conduits go, okay? I have a fellow Frost Mage contributor who's going to provide me some of that info, but he's on vacation right now, and I don't really want to delay this video any longer, so as soon as I get that, I will either update this video or I'll put out a new one for you guys, okay? Now, if you're playing a Venthyr Frost Mage, Nadia is really your only choice for Soulbind because Thrillseeker and Euphoria are just too good, okay? First and foremost, I'll start with my rule number one. Your first conduit is always Icy Propulsion, period. Lowers your Ice Veins cooldown when you crit. But the most important thing about IP is that it's our best conduit by far, but only if you're maximizing it. In other words, if you're using Icy Veins aggressively on cooldown, and you're not holding onto it for very long, and you're getting as many crits into that window as possible. And this is especially true in Mythic Plus, where if you do it right, you can have Icy Veins up on almost every pack. And another Frost Mage contributor friend of mine, Ultimate Zero, has an awesome video on this that I will link below. Now, your second conduit actually depends on a few things, mostly which legendary you're wearing and what level of these conduits you have available. So obviously conduits have, levels 184, 200, 213, 226, etc. And this is something you can sim for your own character with raid bots. And actually, my next video is going to be all about how to sim your character, if you don't already know how to do that. But for now, I will attempt to give some general recommendations. Okay, so if you're using the Slick Ice Legendary, which you're probably only doing on pure single target fights, with no ads whatsoever. Dauntless Duelist, down here, this gives you 3% more flat damage to a single target. And if your current target dies and you're still in combat, it will actually reapply to the next target you hit. And generally, this is your best choice until you get 226 Ice Bite, which is the Ice Lance conduit. Now, 226 Ice Bite usually isn't better than Dauntless per se, but they're roughly even. And as we go on, you'll see that Ice Bite is used in a lot of other combinations. And so it just ends up being not really worth spending the tomes to switch back and forth. Now, as soon as you add a second target into any fight, Ice Bite gains a ton of value. However, if you have access to the Freezing Winds legendary, you're probably going to switch to that, because it's much, much better than Slick Ice in cleave situations. So, if you're using Freezing Winds, usually Ice Bite becomes better from around 200 on up. So 200, 213, and 226. And because you're just getting so many more Ice Lances, you'll really never use anything else but Ice Bite with that Freezing Winds legendary. Last but not least, if you are using the Glacial Fragments legendary, you're probably in a heavy AoE type of content. And there's really only one option for conduits in that situation, and that's Unrelenting Gold, the Frozen Orb conduit. Okay? So now that we already talked a lot about how your conduit choice depends on what legendary you're wearing, so naturally next we're going to talk about which legendary to wear in each situation and each type of content, right? And for what it's worth, if you only make one legendary, I highly recommend that you make Freezing Winds. But if you plan on putting a lot of effort into your Frost Mage at some point, you'll probably make these other legendaries, Slick Ice and Glacial Fragments as well. Freezing Winds might be the best overall, but if you have the Soul Ash, I would probably make Slick Ice second and Glacial Fragments third. All right, so let's talk about rating first, and then we'll talk about Mythic Plus later. Starting out with Shriekwing, you can see that Slick Ice is ahead, right? But not by much. And this is basically because of Shriekwing's intermission phase. Basically, if your Icy Veins comes back off cooldown, like 20 or 30 seconds before intermission, because you're just getting great Icy Propulsion procs, you're usually going to have to hold it for the second damage phase, because you won't even use the full duration before he goes into intermission, which is going to cost you more Icy Propulsion procs, and actually might cause your Icy Veins to be down for most of the next damage phase. So it puts you in this really awkward position of deciding, do I have enough time left to get some value out of it in this damage phase, or should I, sit on it, which is, never optimal, and hold it for the next damage phase. So here's my recommendation. If your group can kill Shriekwing in one damage phase before the intermission, Slick Ice is easily the best choice here. If not, it's up to you. Slick Ice or Freezing Winds. I would probably go with Freezing Winds because that intermission timing thing just really frustrates me. Next up, Huntsman Altimor. This isn't even a question. Freezing Winds is literally perfect for this fight. It's the best possible legendary for this fight by far. Glacial Fragments was very popular on this fight until Freezing Winds got buffed, and I really would never use anything but Freezing Winds on this fight. Next up, Hungering Destroyer. So actually, Slick Ice and Freezing Winds are relatively roughly equal on this fight. There is a lot of uptime. There's no intermission phase or anything like that that really, interrupts your Icy Veins per se. But there is a lot of movement, but, players who are very good at DPSing through their procs and through their movement, it can kind of work around that and, really continue to keep a high uptime on your Icy Veins and get a lot of value out of Slick Ice. However, because of the amount of movement in this fight, Freezing Winds does exceptionally well on this fight, especially if you use a Frozen Orb whenever you have to move. I wouldn't, recommend holding it for very long, if there's upcoming movement, but realistically, there's movement pretty regularly in this fight. So honestly, this is your personal choice. Play around with both, see which one you like more. They're both good here. Sun King Salvation. There was a time where I would have said, hey, for Mythic proc, the DPS shield that you have to burst through kind of makes this more of a single target priority fight, and I would have recommended Slick Ice. It's not optimal, but it was the best we had at the time, and people using Glacial Fragments were usually, once you had the fight on farm and you wanted to, get some good logs and pad a bit, those days are gone. Freezing Winds is the all-around best legendary on this fight. Nothing else even comes close. Regardless of difficulty, heroic, mythic, you name it, Freezing Winds. Artificer Xy'mox. Here it's going to be either Slick Ice or Freezing Winds. They're both relatively close. You can see from the stats, Slick Ice is a little better. And I've had a lot of people ask me about this lately in Mage Discord. And my answer is that even on Mythic, where there's a lot of crazy overlaps, and you're, as a mage, you're probably going to be assigned to running Seeds out of the raid, all the way to the other end of the room. And if you master using Alter Time to get back to the raid very quickly, you will be away from the raid for no more than like 5 seconds at a time, tops. Until you master Alter Time, if you're double blinking, shimmering over to the other end of the room, dropping off the seed, and then you're going for the portal, etc. Yeah, you're going to lose a lot of uptime on Slick Ice. And this is where Freezing Winds would be better for you. However, my advice, practice your alter time on this fight and stick with Slick Ice. Once you master alter time, and I have a couple of other videos on my YouTube of me doing a very good job with the seeds. If you want, something to help you, practice that. But ultimately, I would stick with Slick Ice here, and this is going to end up being one of the few fights in the raid where I would stick with Slick Ice. Next up is Lady Darkvein. And for what it's worth, I was a holdout of Slick Ice on this fight for a very long time, even after Freezing Winds got buffed in 9.05. But once I finally tried it, I'll never use anything but Freezing Winds here. And my logic at the time was, I personally hold my Frozen Orb for the ad spawns on this fight. And my logic was, anytime you're holding Frozen Orb, you're getting less and less value out of Freezing Winds. Doesn't even matter, man. Even if you're holding Frozen Orb for the ads and you're just sitting on it for a little while, Freezing Winds just absolutely decimates the ads. And because you're getting so much more cleave on so many more targets, it blows Slick Ice away. Slick Ice cannot keep up in this fight. It can't. Council of Blood is going to be probably either Freezing Winds or Glacial Fragments. Glacial Fragments does actually have some value here, but it depends. In my opinion, it depends on whether you're progging this fight or whether you have it on farm. And it depends on your raid, okay? And it also depends on your kill order, because, in Mythic, you're not going to see too much variation in kill order. But, on Heroic, I've seen it done several different orders. For instance, if you do Nyx, Stav, Frida, you don't even get waiters at all in Heroic. And so, depending on your kill order, if you do get waiters, and let's say you have like a Death Knight, slappy hands gripping everything into the group, and you're able to stack up those waiters and AoE them down, Glacial Fragments is going to do very well. If your kill order doesn't involve getting waiters, or if you have a bunch of boomkins, they're probably going to burst the waiters down, or maybe you don't have a Death Knight to grip the waiters in. All of those things are drastically going to reduce the value of Glacial Fragments on this fight and increase the value of Freezing Winds. Okay. I am a huge fan of Freezing Winds, especially for Mythic on this fight, because once you kill one of the targets, the after images keep coming back out. So between the waiters and the attendants and the after images, you're always having a ton of targets to funnel with your Blizzard, get your Frozen Orb back up again, and just dump damage into the primary target. So I personally prefer Freezing Winds on this fight. Sludgefist. So you're going to see from the stats that Slick Ice looks way, way better than Freezing Winds on this fight. And it can be. So here's my opinion. Slick Ice has a much higher potential top end on this fight, but it requires a lot more luck and RNG. With Slick Ice, basically you have to have good procs up going into every pillar. Get good procs during every pillar. And if you do, all that extra, Frostbolt haste that you're getting throughout the whole fight is going to put Slick Ice on top by a pretty fair margin here. If you look at the numbers down here, you'll see the max that someone has done with Slick Ice versus Freezing Winds is like an extra almost 1,000 DPS here. 900 to 1,000 here. And that's exactly what I mean. The best parses with Slick Ice are going to be amazing. But Freezing Winds has a much more consistent damage on this fight. Every pillar, you pretty much have a guaranteed Frozen Orb. You have one at the start, and you have one on every pillar. You're getting guaranteed procs throughout every pillar phase. You're actually doing consistent burst during the pillars. So ultimately, Freezing Wind's top end is not going to be as high on Sludgefist, but its average is going to be higher. Okay. Stone Legion Generals, especially in Mythic, which I know a lot of you care about, is going to depend on your raid group and what they need. So, from a pure statistics standpoint, yes, Glacial Fragments is better on this fight, as you can see. You know, people are doing like almost 10,200 with Glacial Fragments and about 9,000 with Freezing Winds. But the difference is, I mean, as you know, Glacial Fragments has that kind of even, that flat AoE damage profile. It's going to kill everything at kind of the same rate. And if your guild is having issues where commandos or skirmishers are getting pushed to their shield point before they're supposed to, Glacial Fragments might not be the best choice. Or sometimes your raid leader might assign you a job of being funnel on either the boss or the Goliath, probably. Okay, and in that case, Freezing Winds is going to be by far your best bet. You're going to get so much extra damage out of that funnel, being able to funnel on the commandos and skirmishers and all of that, that Freezing Winds is going to gain a ton of value. One of the suggestions I've heard is that if you have, so let's say 2 Frost Mages in your raid, it could be really beneficial for one of them to run Freezing Winds and the other to run Glacial Fragments. And I like that suggestion. You know, if you only have one, I personally enjoy Freezing Winds on this fight, but my job is also to tunnel the boss. And so, you know, Freezing Winds is perfect for that. I think it's a toss-up here. But realistically, most guilds that down this fight are going to do, you know, at least like 200 some odd pulls on this, plus 200 to 300 or more. To say the least, you've got time to try both of them and see which one you feel like, and, you know, maybe coordinate with your raid leader and say, hey, I'm gonna try my other legendary for the couple pulls, see how it feels on, you know, the damage profile as a whole. You know, those are things you can be watching out for. But it's a toss-up here. They're situational. So it's funny. For Sire, actually, originally I thought that I was going to have to go down to Heroic here because there wouldn't be enough sample size of actual Frostmage parses on Mythic Sire. And for what it's worth, there aren't many. There's only like, you know, 50 or 60. But looking at Mythic, it shows something really interesting that highlights the point I was going to make anyway. No one is using anything but Freezing Winds here, except there's like 4 people using Glacial Fragments, and they didn't do very well. So Freezing Winds is excellent on Sire because it's great at heavy movement. And if there's a fight that has heavy movement, it's Sire Denathrius. There's not a ton of cleave, but there's a fair bit of cleave, especially in phase 2. But even if we look at Heroic here real quick, you're still going to see Freezing Winds way out ahead. So I know I sound like a broken record here, but, you know, I'm going to recommend Freezing Winds again here. I don't really know if there's more than one fight in the past, you know, 10 bosses that we talked about where I don't recommend Freezing Winds. And, you know, I'm not trying to sell you on Freezing Winds here. I mean, I think the stats speak for themselves. It is great on almost everything, except maybe Xy'mox is probably the only fight where I would still run Slick Ice. And now, you know, if you've been playing a Frost Mage for a while, you know, in 9.0, Freezing Winds was not buffed yet, so naturally we had to recommend Slick Ice and Glacial Fragments for either a single target or an AoE scenario at that time, because it was the best we had. But it's not anymore. Freezing Winds really has become, with the buff, a great one-size-fits-all kind of jack-of-all-trades legendary. It's good. And it perfectly fills the niche that Frost Mages are good at, which is funnel. So, yeah, Freezing Winds on almost every fight here, guys. Now, last but not least, let's talk about Mythic Plus and when to use Glacial Fragments versus Freezing Winds. Now, there's a lot of people out there that still, they have both of them and they just prefer Glacial Fragments. And that's absolutely fine. If you like Glacial Fragments, keep using Glacial Fragments. But by all means, as long as you understand its weaknesses, okay? Glacial Fragments does not do very well in any scenario where there's a lot of kiting going on. The tank has to pull mobs out of your blizzard. And we'll go over the affixes, briefly here in a bit. But there's several affixes where the tank has to kite a lot. And also, Glacial Fragments doesn't really do very good damage on single target at all. I mean, all of its damage is AoE. So great on trash packs, not very good on Prideful or bosses. So as long as Prideful is the seasonal affix, Glacial Fragments is not going to perform as well on the Prideful and on the bosses. And so most of the Frost Mages that I've spoken with fairly regularly that are doing 20, 21, 22 level keys, if you're doing lower keys like 10, 15, you can absolutely use whichever legendary you want. At higher keys, however, I mean, Glacial Fragments, it'll work, but to some extent, everybody has to be capable of doing some better single target burst on the Prideful and on the bosses. And so I'm personally going to recommend Freezing Winds for any Tyrannical week, which is every other week. And beyond that, in Fortified week, for the most part, you can use either one, whichever you prefer. But let's look at the affixes a little bit, okay? Bursting, I mean, it's not bad, but Glacial Fragments is going to kill everything, at an even rate, which means there's a greater chance of things kind of all dying at the same time. And with Bursting, that's bad, right? Bolstering is actually a great case for Glacial Fragments. Bolstering is definitely one of the cases where I would specifically use Glacial Fragments on that week. Spiteful can go either way. Inspiring is actually very good for Freezing Winds. However, obviously these both occur on the same week. Necrotic is very bad for Glacial Fragments because your tank is going to be kiting a lot on this week. So this week, the Tyrannical Inspiring Necrotic week is... You might kind of be inting if you're playing Glacial Fragments on this week. No offense, but if you're going to wear Freezing Winds for like 1 week, that's the one, man. Sanguine, again, lots of tank kiting, so he's constantly going to be moving targets out of your blizzard. I mean, even if you're really good at kind of like leading the tank kite path, you're still going to be losing a lot of damage. Now, yes, Freezing Winds also loses damage when the tank kites out of your blizzard, right? Because you're not getting as much cooldown reduction on your orb. It doesn't lose as much. So when your tank pulls the mobs out of your blizzard with Glacial Fragments, you're doing like no damage. At least with Freezing Winds, you're losing a little cooldown reduction, but you're still doing fine. You know what I mean? And last but not least, Raging isn't really that significant of an affix, but again, you're not really going to want to kill things kind of evenly at the same rate. So there's a lot of affixes that make it much more problematic to use Glacial Fragments, whether it be tank kiting or trying not to kill things all at the same time. However, when you can, when it's optimal to kill things all at the same time, Glacial Fragments is very good at that. For instance, let's say you pull a pack of 4 or 5 mobs in mists, and as soon as you kill it, or as soon as you kill a couple of them, you're going to have a Prideful. You don't want extra adds to be high health when you're going into a Prideful. Glacial Fragments is very good at that. So the problem is that the great use cases for Glacial Fragments are few and far between in Mythic Plus now. It was fine when it was the best legendary we had, but it's not anymore. Okay. One other thing, affixes aside, there's a couple of dungeons that have a couple special considerations. First of all, Necrotic Wake. The second half of Necrotic Wake, everything after Amarth, the second boss, where you fly up to the necropolis. The pathing or the way they've programmed that is buggy, and Glacial Fragments doesn't work properly up there. Essentially, the game, for some reason, can't tell that mobs are in your blizzard, so you're not getting the 100% proc rate of Glacial Fragments up there. So half the dungeon, Glacial Fragments falls off significantly. There's plenty of AoE to be done in the first half of the dungeon that still justifies using Glacial Fragments in Necrotic Wake if you want to. But for that reason, I don't recommend using Glacial Fragments in Necrotic Wake because its damage tanks and falls off pretty hard for the second half of the dungeon. Next up is Theater of Pain. So, as anyone who has run Theater of Pain probably knows all too well, there's just very few AoE packs in Theater of Pain. There's so many single pulls. There's 5 bosses. Freezing Winds is going to go a lot further here. I don't use Glacial Fragments on any affixes in Theater of Pain. It's Freezing Winds regardless of affix for this dungeon for me. Last but not least, one minor concern for Frost Mage is in the other side. It's not so big an issue on Fortified, but especially on Tyrannical. Most of the dungeon is fine, no issue whatsoever. But when you get to Wazala's platform ads, you have a pretty short window to burst them down. And, the strat that most groups use is, each DPS goes to one platform and solos one of those. Well, on Tyrannical, they have a lot more health. And even if you're Venthyr, to use Mirrors of Torment to generate procs, it doesn't work on those platform ads. So essentially, you don't really have any way to generate procs, which can make it very hard for you. Even with all your cooldowns up, if you just get unlucky with procs and you don't generate any Fingers of Frost or any Brain Freeze, it's going to be hard for you to kill those platform ads on Tyrannical. Unless you have Freezing Winds, which generates several guaranteed procs. Alright guys, so let's recap really quick. If you're a Venthyr Frost Mage, you're using Nadia from Thrill Seeker. Your first conduit is always Icy Propulsion. Your second conduit depends what level, what rank of the other conduits of Ice Bite you have available to you and what legendary you're wearing. If you have 226 Ice Bite, you're pretty much always wearing 226 Ice Bite except with Glacial Fragments. If you're wearing Slick Ice Legendary and you have less than 226 Ice Bite, you're going this path toward Dauntless Duelist. If you have 226 Ice Bite and you're wearing Slick Ice, I would usually just stick with this path, okay? If you're wearing the Freezing Winds Legendary, I would go Ice Bite as long as you have at least 200. 200, 213, or 226. You're going to be great with Ice Bite there. Last but not least, if you're using Glacial Fragments Legendary, you're probably going to want to use Unrelenting Cold, the Frozen Orb Conduit. Next up, raid bosses in Castle Nathria. For Shriekwing, it's going to be either Slick Ice or Freezing Winds. If your group can kill Shriekwing before the first intermission, it's Slick Ice, hands down. However, if you can't, it's kind of your choice. Freezing Winds is going to cause you less frustration with Icy Vein's timing around the intermission. For Huntsman, it's Freezing Winds all the way. For Hungering Destroyer, it's a toss-up between Slick Ice and Freezing Winds. For Sun King Salvation, Kael'thas, it's Freezing Winds. For Artificer, you can use either Slick Ice or Freezing Winds. Slick Ice is going to be better if you get a lot of practice with using your alter time to get back to the boss quickly after running seeds. Lady Darkvein is going to be, again, Freezing Winds. Council of Blood, is a toss-up between Freezing Winds and Glacial Fragments, depending on your raid comp and your kill order. Sludgefist is kind of a toss-up between Slick Ice and Freezing Winds. Slick Ice is going to have a higher potential top end, but it's going to require you a lot more luck and RNG to reach it. Stone Legion Generals, especially on Mythic, is a toss-up between Freezing Winds and Glacial Fragments, depending on what your raid group needs. And last but not least, all of the very heavy movement on Sire Denathrius makes Freezing Winds the go-to here. And there is slightly more cleave going on in Mythic Sire than there is with the previous difficulties. So, again, if you can only craft one legendary for the raid, make it Freezing Winds. And for Mythic Plus, if you're running Necrotic Wake or Theater of Pain, regardless of affix, on tyrannical weeks and any week where your tank has to do a lot of kiting, which is going to pull mobs out of your blizzard, such as Necrotic and Sanguine, Freezing Winds is going to be your go-to. Glacial Fragments will do okay, but Freezing Winds will be noticeably stronger on those weeks. Ultimately, they are both excellent choices for Mythic Plus. They have different strengths and weaknesses, but if you play to those strengths and weaknesses, regardless of the week or the affix, you can do very well with either of them. All right, guys, I really hope you enjoyed this video and got something useful out of it. Check out my Twitch stream most nights between 6 to 10 p.m. Pacific. And if you have any questions or anything else you'd like to see, by all means, drop a comment below. Let me know. Thanks.